that Hasina begins this session.
Okay,
So over to her.
Over to Hasina.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are, Hasina. You're audible.
Okay. Welcome to the final session of the 3-day international webinar on planetary crisis and the humanities prospects in theory and praxis, organized by the Department of English, Alia University, Kolkata. Before we begin, again, a gentle reminder to the participants that you kindly switch off the video and keep the audio in mute mode. Take note that you do not start presenting the screen. And if you have any questions, kindly put them up in the chat box and we will hand over those to the speaker at the end of our talk. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Ayelet Ben-Yishai. Welcome, ma'am. She teaches post-colonial and Victorian literature at the University of Haifa, where she is also chair of the English department. In addition to her first book, Common Precedents, which came out in Oxford 2013, her work has been published in Novel, Modern Fiction Studies, Journal of Commonwealth Literature, and the 19th Century Literature, among others. She is currently completing a manuscript on the literary and cultural history of the Indian emergency. We are fortunate, ma'am, to have you here for a second time. And I fondly remember your visit to our university just a few months back. So thank you again. Today, she will be speaking on emergency, our chronic crisis. And this session will be moderated by Professor Amjad Hussain, sir, and Dr. Tajuddin Ahmed, sir. I hand over now to the moderators. Thank you. Sir, over to you.
Amjad, sir, are you there?
No, you continue, please. I told you.
Okay. So far as the title of Professor Dr. Ben-Yishai is concerned, it is emergency, the chronic crisis. I was trying to make some sense of that, because in this time of planetary crisis, in fact, the whole world is in a kind of emergency. Emergency in every sphere of life we have to attend. And there are, of course, other more literal emergencies about which we are familiar in the political sphere. And so far as my understanding is concerned, on the philosophical plane also, especially after the advent of modernity, we people are almost always in a kind of emergency, always in hurry, trying to do something in a kind of competitive mode always. So at least 3 layers of emergency we can see right now in front of us. And I'm very sure this talk by Dr. Ben-Yishai will be very enriching to all of us. And we will have, I expect, a rather enriching conversation after the talk. So it's now over to you, Dr. Ben-Yishai. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you all, and Professor Shamistra and everyone else, and Taj and everyone else, for your lovely invitation. And yes, it seems that I think it was just a little bit exactly 6 months ago that I was actually in Kolkata, in the days where we could get on a plane and get off at another side of the world. And my visit to your university was one of the highlights of my trip, and I really enjoyed the conversations that we had there. So I'm delighted to be back here again, though I would much have preferred to fly to Calcutta and see you and talk to you all in person. But, you know, since that is not a possibility, I happily accept this this format. And please stop me if something goes wrong technically, if you can't hear me or if you can't see me or something like that. Anyway, yes, your introduction raised exactly the questions. What happened that I'm interested in, right? So these are the big questions, the philosophical, right? What happens when one emergency overlays another emergency? What happens if we're in an ongoing emergency and then a pandemic comes on the top of the emergency, right? How do different emergencies relate to each others? And so that's the big kind of question that sort of underlies my talk, though I will be focusing on the emergency in 1975 to 1977, and I'll explain everything. But anyway, so I will go from the pandemic to the 1970s, and then at the end come back again to some questions that we can maybe talk about in the final in Q questions after. So I'm going to begin my talk. So an inevitable political side effect of the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 has been a renewed consideration of states of emergency, those that are employed variously worldwide to combat the global health crisis, right? So we have many emergencies, which is one emergency. Hold on, let me turn off my phone, sorry. In many of these countries around the world, and India prominent among them, the emergency measures sat far too easily with ongoing erosions of democratic government and governance. The severe limitations to individual and collective rights carried out for the sake of public health seemed oddly familiar or of a piece with those already in place in the name of security or public safety. In India, the harsh and hastily imposed lockdown that left millions of migrant workers to their gruesome fate resonated with the anti-Muslim riots in New Delhi in January, which in turn followed on the heels of the 2019 Citizen Amendment Act, and then the abrogation by presidential decree of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, and other authoritarian measures instituted by what is increasingly called the undeclared emergency led by the BJP. Emergency measures that seem to form an amalgam of crisis and continuity, right? A nexus that, as Gyan Prakash, the historian, is only the most recent to show, forms the relationship of the emergency to its past, right? So there's the emergency, but the emergency has a past. In his book, Emergency Chronicles, which was published last year, his long-awaited history of the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi in 1975 to 1977, he argues that the long-standing issue of Indian society's troubled relationship with democratic values are still at the root of Indian politics and society today. This troubled relationship seems also to be the cause for a larger surge of political and scholarly interest in the Indian emergency of the 1970s. Okay? Indeed, emergency situations in India and around the world have always presented a complicated and ostensibly paradoxical mix of crisis and continuity, of an anomaly that is both a contrast to the ordinary and yet at the same time a part of a chronic situation. Now, arguing that the state of exception, the emergency, has become the new normal has also by now become a cliche in itself. It is indeed the most obvious way of reading the tension between crisis and continuity. However, rather than pointing out that the state of emergency is mundane, though it is, or that it is rooted in colonial structure, which it is, I'm trying to pay attention to how it functions simultaneously as exceptional and non-exceptional. To talk about the emergency not only as an event and as a crisis, but also as a figure for the chronic condition of Indian democratic society and culture in the late 20th century, and 21st century, as in other countries around the world. Indeed, as a literary scholar, and we're talking about the humanities, right? What can we contribute to this understanding? As a literary scholar, I would like us to think of the emergencies as a genre, as a set of socially agreed upon conventions that have coalesced into a category, that of emergency. A genre is a complicated mixture of the singular and the general, where each individual text is unique, but draws on or manifests a series of conventions that make it understandable as part of a category. So if we're reading a detective novel, each detective novel is unique, but we recognize it as part of a genre, which is the genre of the detective novel, right? Or if we're reading a sonnet, each sonnet is unique, but it's part of the genre of the sonnet, right? Each individual work, text or work of art or event also inflects and influences the genre, right? So each individual iteration of it influences the genre as a whole. And as a result, genres are dynamic and flexible and thus indispensable for making sense of the unpredictable. Similarly, each emergency situation is unique in its events, its circumstances, its historical context. It's what makes it a crisis, an emergency, right? It's unique, it's unprecedented. And yet, when viewed together, these singular crisis-driven emergencies constitute, I would like to say, a genre, variations on a theme. They share a set of common characteristics and, more importantly, give rise to a similar set of expectations and meanings. In other words, I suggest that we think through the paradox of crisis and continuity that characterizes our states of emergency by considering them as a genre. So in my talk today, I focus on the state of emergency, which I'm studying and I'm writing a book about in 1970s India. Now, I'm sure you all know this, but I'll very quickly give a little refresher about this, okay? So I'm going to share a little presentation. Can you see my presentation? Oh,
yes, we do.
Okay, good. So this is a very quick refresher, right? In June 1975, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi famously imposed a state of emergency throughout the country in response to what she called the deep and widespread conspiracy against her. The immediate trigger was a court ruling invalidating Gandhi's election invalidating Gandhi's election due to misconduct in her 1971 campaign. More generally, Gandhi's increasing power and authoritarianism had prompted the rise of oppositional forces led by one of her father's closest friends, the universally loved former independence activist Jayaprakash Narayan, known as JP. Threatened by these oppositions, Gandhi acted swiftly and ruthlessly. Across the country, tens of thousands were detained without trial and sent to jail, where many were tortured. JP and other oppositional leaders from the left and mainly from the right were also arrested. Basic civil liberties were suspended. Elections for parliament and state governments were postponed. The constitution was amended. Freedom of the press was suspended, and heavy censorship imposed. Houses and bazaars, were demolished in the name of slum eradication or beautification. And finally, and perhaps most horrifically, Gandhi's son, Sanjay, led a widespread forced sterilization campaign targeting many of the nation's poor and indigent. The emergency ended as soon as it began, as abruptly as it began. In January 1977, the Prime Minister astonished the nation yet again when she decided to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections, in which she was roundly defeated. her surprising return to power in 1980, her son Sanjay's death a few months later, her assassination in 1984, all of these hasten the desire to forget the period which was swiftly relegated to the status of anomaly in India's democratic history. That is, until recent years. Okay, so that was a quick summary. So when I say emergency now, I mean this, in my talk, when I say the emergency, I mean this 1975-77 one. But since we're talking about emergency in the genre, in the Q&A and at the very end of my talk, I can make comparative detours to the state of emergency in which I live in Israel, Palestine. There's also obviously the third context, right, which is that of India today with the pandemic emergency and other ongoing emergencies, which you can bring up. But in examining the tension between crisis and continuity, right, which is my thing here, I will discuss two examples from two very different kinds of texts and different kinds of different genres. The first might be known to some of you. I'm talking about Rohinton Mystery's very successful novel. I'm just turning on the presentation again. Rohinton Mystery's very successful novel. Here we go. A Fine Balance, which takes place during the state of emergency imposed by Prime Minister Gandhi from June 1975 to March, right, our emergency. Do you see the slides? Yes? So
Yes, we do.
thank you. Ishvar, and so in this novel, right, the two protagonists, Ishvar and his nephew kumars, who try to escape caste violence in their village, are apprenticed to become tailors by a Muslim family friend from a neighboring village who they call Ashraf Chacha. The two move to Bombay to work as tailors, where they are caught up in the horrors of the emergency, including the demolition of the slum in which they live. In the novel's climax, Ishvar and return to Ashraf Chacha's village, are captured and sent to a sterilization camp. In retribution for defiantly spitting at the local racketeer who had murdered his father, is castrated. Instead of just the sterilization, he's castrated. Ishvar undergoes the nusbandi, the vasectomy operation, but the operation, which is supposed to be simple and painless, goes terribly wrong. Gangrene spreads through his legs, which are then duly amputated. By the time they return from the camp, and Ishvar discover that their friend and benefactor, Ashraf Chacha, has been beaten to death. So even in this horrible chapter, the trains throughout this time are on time, creating an evident tension between the emergency, by definition a time of crisis, of irregular and unusual events, and the stable, recurring regularity of the train's strange punctuality. Indeed, the entire chapter narrating these utmost horrors, climactic even within this unrelenting novel, is permeated with an odd sense of regularity, stability, commensurability, and cyclicality. The chapter begins, appropriately enough, with the arrival of the train carrying and Ishvar into town. So this is before all the horrors have happened. To their surprise, their friend is there to meet them. "How did you know we were coming today?" "I didn't," he smiled, "but I knew it would be this week. And the train rolls in at the same hour every day." This image of Chacha at the railway station establishes the iterative mood of the entire chapter, where an event described only once evokes a regular repetition of the self-same event. Ironically, it is the image of the train on time only during the emergency which establishes the anticlimactic, anti-emergency tone of this chapter and even of the novel as a whole. Consider the following passage in the same chapter, depicting Depicting the activity in the station once the train has left. Okay, so I'm quoting here at length. But the emptiness was transitory. Slowly, more than a dozen figures materialized from the shadows of the sheds and storehouses. Lapped in rugs, wrapped in hunger, they lowered their brittle bodies over the edge of the platform onto the rails and began moving systematically down the tracks from sleeper to sleeper, searching for the flotsam of railway journeys, bending now and then, collecting the garbage of the travelers. When the two hands grabbed the same prize, there was a tussle. They tucked it away in their gunny sacks, then melted into the shadows of the station to store their collections and await the next train. In this description, the figures pick up the debris only once, but the narrative implies that it is a constant action, repeated after the disappearance of every train. The iterative mode is established simultaneously by an overabundance of details and an underdetermination of the characters. These details create a sense of repetition, of bending over and over again to pick up the next in a seemingly endless series of items. Paper, food scraps, plastic bags, bottle tops, broken glass. The work is described as systematic, and as soon as it ends, there's nothing left to do but await the next train. However, while the minutiae of this degrading labor are painstakingly elaborated, the particularity of the laborers themselves is effaced. There are figures who materialize from the shadows and melt back into them. They have no gender, no color, no dress, except that which marks their destitution, lapped in rags, wrapped in hunger. Not only are they not differentiated from each other, they cannot be differentiated from any other tattered army in Indian railway stations. The result is a sense of a portrait of destitution, all the more so because, in a sense, it is infinitely perpetuated. Now, while mystery has been criticized for romanticizing poverty in these descriptions, I want to point out a curious effect. Against the resigned, iterative background, the emergency does not create a sharp contrast. In fact, it just seems like more of the same. Go here, right? He writes, Market day was noisier than usual because the Family Planning Center was promoting its sterilization camp from a booth in the square. In other words, it's always noisy on market day, and the emergency just makes it a little bit more so. More broadly, and yet following a similar logic, the emergency only slightly exacerbates the already difficult life of the lower castes. The novel implies that the poor and disenfranchised, the Dalits, others, have always been at the mercy of the powers that rule them. For them, it is immaterial whether the violence which oppresses them originates from the local zamindar, as it has from time immemorial, or from the central government in New Delhi, as it does now. In a fine balance, the emergency and its horrors seem to be subsumed under the sign of the ordinary. Despite the changes sweeping the country under emergency, things in fact stay the same. So, since we're working with genre, I would like to note that the genre with which Mystery chooses to write this novel is realism. The genre of the prosaic, the ordinary, the day-to-day. Rather than choosing a genre of crisis, say a thriller or another dramatic genre, Mystery pairs the horrific and dramatic content of emergency violence and excess with the most ordinary, uncataclysmic of forms, thus performing the tension between crisis and continuity through the genre of realism to understand the chronic, ordinary problems of Indian democracy via a return to the extraordinary. So now that I've shown that the emergency created a paradoxical continuity rather than a break with the ordinary order of things, I'd like to think now about a different form of continuity within crisis, that which links the current ostensibly unprecedented emergency with previous emergencies. Okay, so there's the sense that each emergency is unique, but that it repeats. And often when I'm talking to people and in India, and I say that I'm conducting research on the emergency, then some people say, yes, emergency, partition, right? So that they conflating the emergency of the 1970s with partition, sometimes even conflating it with 1984 and the anti-Sikh riots and the crisis then, right? So there's this conflation of emergency following emergency. So now I want to go, so in thinking about emergency in relation to previous emergencies, I want to go to read another genre altogether. This is a prison diary, okay, written by Shanta Kumar, which I'm sure none of you have ever encountered this diary. It's largely unknown. Shanta Kumar was then a member of the Himachal Pradesh Legislative Assembly for the opposition Bharatiya Jana Sangh Party as the emergency breaks out in 1975. So Kumar, like hundreds and indeed thousands of other members of Gandhi's political opposition, was arrested in the first days of the emergency and spent the rest of its days in jail under administrative or preventative detention. While in jail, he, like many others imprisoned before him and with him, he wrote a diary. Now, before we look at the diary more closely, I want to say that the prison memoir is a very important Indian genre, right? From Nehru to Gandhi, one that is intimately tied to the formation of a modern Indian national subject. It is, of course, also tied to colonial rule, right? It became as much a nationalist convention for political prisoners to write their prison memoirs as it was a patriotic duty for newspaper editors and book publishers to put them into print, says Durba Ghosh, historian Durba Ghosh. Indeed, Ghosh recognizes two waves of publication of prison histories and memoirs, both of them unsurprisingly tied to peaks in emergency-related legislation. The first was in the 1920s, following the amnesties of those arrested in the Rowlatt era legislation. These memoirs, she argues, were written and published with the hope of reinvigorating a radical anti-colonial movement. The second wave was published immediately after 1947. Its main impetus was to inscribe in national history a movement which had largely been secret. Okay, so indeed, historian Nasser Hussain, showed that the colonial problem of emergency has continued both implicitly and explicitly into the post-colonial and the independence period and into the national state, right? We see this today. So the colonial era emergencies, which we thought was colonial, continue well after independence. This is evident in Kumar's diary, which I will open now. This is evident in Kumar's diary, which repeats the same themes and motifs that populate colonial era prison narratives. So here he is. This is a picture of him, a more recent picture, and this is a picture of the diary. It's called a Chief Minister's Prison Diary. Okay, so Kumar's diary repeats the same themes and motifs that populate colonial era prison narratives. These include imprisonment as a time of moral purification through celibacy, through yoga, fasting, other religious rituals, hunger strikes, an obsession with classification as political rather than criminal prison, and also the use of colonial era terminology such as détenus for detainees and satyagraha to refer to any form of political action or protest. There's references to the entire country being a prison, also reminiscent of colonial era, an insistence on patriotism and outrage at their incarceration. At times, Kumar makes this comparison explicit. For example, when describing his surveillance by police while on leave, he writes, "Had the British been ruling, I would probably not have felt as suffocated. But in free India, innocent patriots were being shadowed like criminals. I couldn't stand it." Okay. Recasting the emergency as colonial tendency was part of the larger recasting the emergency in colonial terms was part of the larger tendency to fuse the current crisis with colonial continuity. More concretely, presenting the emergency as a second freedom struggle, the legacy of political imprisonment to Indian independence was never far from mine. JP's own prison memoirs refers to his break in the habit of jail going for 29 years. Similarly, referring to the celebrated series of letters which Nehru, then imprisoned in British jails, wrote to his daughter in the early 1930s, it was said in Delhi during the emergency that Indira is in the Prime Minister house and Jawaharlal is back to writing letters to her from jail again, right? So inflating JP with Jawaharlal Nehru and so on. Also significant is that the prison memoir was not only colonial genre, but a colonial genre, by which I mean that it functions not only as a mode of representation, what it says about life in prison, but as a certain set of conventions and expectations, right? Where this is what we're talking, within which its form and content garners meaning. In other words, no matter its context or contents, a genre already carries with it a certain set of meanings by virtue of its form. To understand this, let's consider the following quotation in which Kumar describes his first imprisonment in 1953 at the age of 17. So this is not during the emergency, but a previous imprisonment in 1953. He's 17 years old and he was imprisonment for what he calls a satyagraha in favor of the annexation of Jammu and Kashmir, right? He's a young RSS activist. Note that the colonial prison narratives provided a model for him for patriotic political behavior and values. I had left the staggering financial conditions in my family, my ailing sister, and my 17-day-old job behind, thinking that Kashmir was the crown of India and therefore anything could be sacrificed for it. But the lofty patriotic ideals were shaken by this narrow smelling cell in the police station, coupled with the insulting behaviors of the police. I then recollected the episodes of Indian revolutionaries in British jails, which I'd read as a child and felt strengthened. Note the doubling up of genre. Kumar presents a memoir writing about a memoir. One can only imagine that he is imagining the children who will one day be strengthened by his own narrative, right? So we might also note that this passage, in fact, refers to 3 different incarcerations. His emergency detention, from which Kumar is narrating the story in 1975. The second one is his arrest as a 17-year-old in 1953. And the earliest is not his incarceration, but the pre-47 mass incarceration of Indian revolutionaries, to which he refers here and from which he receives his inspiration. The 3 incarcerations juxtapose, even conflate 3 very different moments in modern Indian history, and it's this juxtaposition that I'm exploring here. Another thing to note is that the account of the imprisonment itself is very boring. Very little happens in jail. But more important, very little happens to make him go to jail. It is the nature of administrative detention that it does not follow meaningful action. Otherwise, one would be tried for one's action, right? Administrative detention, as we know, right, is when you are incarcerated when you didn't do anything, right? One is incarcerated for who one is, a political opponent, rather from what one does, a crime. This creates a certain paradox. While the political meaning of being a political prison lies in being incarcerated, having done nothing, narrative meaning, right, resides in action. But when one is incarcerated for an action that was not taken, right, Kumar didn't really do anything. The story and the claim for political action lies in incarceration itself and its very preposterousness, right? So that's why when he says a chief minister's political freedom, how could it be that I, a chief minister, was in prison? Moreover, even routine stories about life in prison become problematic in this context because they become narratives about prisoners, far too close to the stories of common criminals, right? So Kumar actually does nothing other than being a politician in opposition narrative that warranted arrest. And so he could be considered, right? So a lot of the diary is him trying to prove that he is a political prisoner, right? He's trying to gain political credentials to hold on. Oh, okay. I messed things up here a little bit. Never mind. I'll read it anyway. So he writes, "We were political prisoners and not convicts, and felt it an injustice to be dressed as common criminals. Neither, therefore, did we consent to wear the jail dress, nor work as mazdoors. We protested strongly." And so the genre of the post-colonial memoir primarily and explicitly recasts the post-colonial emergency regime as colonial rule. On the burning flame of the nation, a few patriots, this Kumar writes, right? A few patriots have always sacrificed themselves like the proverbial moth. The history of the country was written on the heroic acts of these few patriots. I was flying high on the wings of patriotism. But this, of course, is where the politics of the story takes an interesting twist. While Kumar is flying high on the wings of patriotism, he's in fact doing so with borrowed feathers. As I've already mentioned, Kumar was a member of the Bharatiya Janata Sangh Party, which was the political arm of the RSS and the forerunner of today's BJP. And the wings, the patriotic wings that he is flying on, were not RSS wings, right? The conflation of these three moments, the independence struggle, especially of the Gandhi and Satyagraha variety, and Kumar's imprisonment for the Kashmir protest and the current emergence period, establishes him without any trace of irony as the patriotic opposition not only to Indira Gandhi and her emergency rule, but also to her father's Nehru's government and the entire Congress Raj. And so while the diary does not lay out much of a political agenda, it masterfully uses the genre of the prison memoir to cast Kumar and fellow detainees as Gandhi's successors, patriotic fighters for a free India, fighting against an illegitimate state. The rhetoric of the political prisoner, the politics of the emergency, had made fellow travelers out of political opponents. When Kumar writes, "I was a small worker, but was it justifiable to throw great patriots like Jayaprakash Narayan, Morarji Desai, and Atal Bihari Vajpayee into the sea?" His false modesty is not the point, but rather the way that he lumps Narayan, Desai, and Vajpayee, three leaders of very different political beliefs and associations. And he puts them together. The three are united not by ideology or political worldview, but by their being political prisoners, which makes them into one political entity of patriots, united structurally, if not ideologically, in opposition to Gandhi and her Congress party. And indeed, immediately following the emergency, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh Party merges with other opposition parties to form the Janata Dal Party, which was to topple Indira Gandhi and form the first non-Congress government in Indian history. As part of this political success, Kumar, as representative of the Janata Dal Party, is appointed chief minister. the way to the ideologically unintelligible but structurally coherent Janata Dal Party is paved by the genres of emergency. Now, emergency detention was, as it remains worldwide to this day, undoubtedly an anti-democratic political practice, right? So I'm not saying, right, under whose auspices extreme state violence, including torture, were carried out. At the same time, it also here afforded, as it did for earlier colonial era détenus, a political boon to a certain class of prisoners who incarcerated their way, whose incarceration paved their way to a political career. I'm not saying that they welcomed it or that they did it in prison, but I do want to argue that the anti-colonial struggle for independence had supplied them with a political template, a genre, one which they exploited for their individual and political gain. Okay? So, right, and of course, Kumar was not alone, right? Indira Gandhi also exploited genres of emergency to bring herself back to being like an anti-colonial a fighter for independence, right? So there was much use made by these genres on all sides of the political spectrum. So finally, our own stakes in thinking about the genres of the emergency and of emergency as genre lie not only in understanding this fraught moment in Indian history, law, and culture, but also in thinking about the prison memoir and the emergency as genres, shaping the political culture of post-emergency India and reflecting on it, especially in our political landscape today that keeps on shifting as we speak. Right? The colonial problem of emergency has reared its head again, and most forcefully in recent years. Indeed, both sides of the growing political divide, even in India today, claim emergency abuses to justify their political stances. The left points out the increasingly troubling similarities between Gandhi's emergency rule and Modi Sarkar, and the right, responding to charges of anti-democratic measures, coyly points out that the emergency, in fact, was carried out by the Congress Party Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. The situation in New Delhi and India during the winter of 2019-2020 and in the ongoing emergency of the global pandemic demands that we take a strongly critical view of emergency facts and fictions to rethink their discursive implications for our time. Rather than viewing the emergency as the anomalous other of Indian democracy, we would do well to think of it as a piece with Indian democracy, part and parcel of its failures and even successes. So that basically ends my talk, but I want to throw out a few questions that we can maybe discuss now. Like, for example, what happens to an emergency when it continues indefinitely? What happens to a crisis when it becomes chronic? What happens when a newer emergency is added on top of the previous ongoing emergency? What becomes visible? What disappears? Right here, I'm thinking, for example, in Israel, Palestine, where I'm living, right? So Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been living under emergency rule, under Israeli occupation and emergency rule since 1967. It's an ongoing emergency, right? And now almost 50, 60 years long, right? 50 years long, right? What happens when a coronavirus pandemic, right? When a newer emergency is added on top of this, right? What becomes visible? What disappears? How are emergencies experienced differentially by various communities and populations? The last questions I want to ask is, what is the end? To what ends is the genre of emergency being used today? Who is it used by today? And why? And I think these are things that we can talk about, but also things that we need to pay attention to. So, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Now, may I request Professor Amjad Hussain if he has something to add upon this, if he feels like summarizing the idea or the usual duties that are bestowed upon the chair of the session. Over to Professor Amjad Hussain.
Well, thank you, Professor Isai. I also teach in the Department of English at Alia University, but unfortunately I couldn't meet you on the earlier occasion when you were here because I was busy with some administrative work. That was a great loss, I think, but yes, it is okay. I have been able to listen to your lecture. I think it is very revealing, very deeply significant talk. You have tried to talk about not only emergency as a genre, I mean emergency as a political event, but also you have tried to analyze some genres of the emergency, literary genres written in memory of emergency. Yes, we are all familiar with the concept of genre, that there will be something unique, but also, yes, there will be conventions, expectations out of a genre. And indeed, from that perspective, the emergency imposed by Indira Gandhi in 1975, that continued till January 1977, yes, that reminds one that particularly those who opposed the emergency, those who were imprisoned, they, you see, in their particularly memoirs, yes, tried to compare themselves with the freedom fighters, with the sort of political emergency imposed by the colonial government. And that way, you see, they tried to justify themselves as patriots. And also, as you mentioned in the context of the memoir written by Shanta Kumar, the Chief Minister's diary, by emphasizing that when he was imprisoned, he remembered the writings that he had read of the revolutionaries, of the freedom fighters as a child. And you implied that he also suggests as if his memoir will be written by his children and they will, you know, in a way link him to the freedom fighters. So in this way, the emergencies of genre will continue. There will be a kind of continuity. And yes, you have tried to link that emergency of 1975-77 to the, say, emergencies, in emergency situations, emergency measures imposed on the people of India during the pandemic, recent pandemic in 2020. You also, yes, have tried to link it, no doubt, although we have not elaborated much. I think we can at least guess what you tried, what you wish to say or intend to say. So thank you very much for all these things. I think there will be questions and other participants might ask the questions, but above all, I would like to thank you for focusing on what is called a black chapter in Indian history, Indian history of the, say, emergency. But now, yes, we are talking about an unclear opposition, minorities, the vulnerable sections of the people, population, the Dalits, etc. They are very much, you see, suffering because of the undeclared emergency imposed by the Modi Sarkar. So we have to think about all these things. it is a chronic emergency that we are, say, undergoing. Thank you for such an enlightening talk. Yes, that will be my takeover from here.
Thank you, Amjad sir. Now we might take questions from the chat box, but before that, let me just say one thing. I love that expression that, Madam, you have used regarding Shanta Kumar's prison diary, where he was saying that he was flying high on the wings of patriotism. But you succinctly mentioned that he actually was flying high on the borrowed wings. Okay, borrowed wings which actually these people had never used. And you had mentioned two particular juncture of Indian history, one being the Indian freedom movement, the other being the accession of Kashmir. On both those occasions, the role that was played by Jansang and other similar sort of organizations, that was not patriotic, to say the least. So yes, borrowing others' wings is a perfectly apt expression for that sort of memoir. And then the questions that you have raised, probably we will go on looking answers for these questions, because I don't know whether you have been there in the session in which Shamantagda was talking, and we do have this perpetual crisis and emergency. It's not just about India, it's not just about Modi government, but in many of the countries of the world, including USA, to some extent Turkey, Brazil, a process is on in which the democratic institutions are being undermined by the democratic process itself, so that there are means and methods by which things are being legalized. At the same time, voices of people are being suppressed. For example, I cannot exactly put the term that is being used. So far as democracy, this term is concerned right now, lawcracy or something like that is being used in many of the political discourses that we have, especially in case of Brazil, where judiciary is hand in glove with the other democratic institutions, so that ultimately it gives a kind of authoritative power to the government. And democracy is in deep crisis because of that. So these are the questions that we have to consider, and how we'll be able to manage to negotiate with these kind of situations. These are larger issues and very important issues for that matter. Thank you, ma'am, for raising all these issues. And now I'm going to read out some of the questions that are there in the chat box. You yourself can see the questions, but being a moderator, it's imperative on me to read out some of the questions. Please, ma'am. This question is from Shormishta D. Madam, do you think the perpetual situation of emergency in nations like India creates greater capacity to be resilient to the crisis? At the same time, develop a discourse of political apathy and skirmishes towards the pandemic? Ma'am, your response.
Thank you very much for your super insightful responses, and of course, you both of you kind of really nailed these problems that come up, and I'll begin with responding to this question, but I'll also respond to the things that you said, that you're absolutely right. Right. The perpetual situation of emergency nations like India, Israel, where I live, Israel, Palestine, right? And then also in the United States. I mean, you know, the eruption of the Black Lives Matter protest in the United States, right? Even protests in Belarus, right? So what we see is that underlying protests that maybe have not been visible, the new sort of pandemic crisis has made visible the chronic ongoing crisis. Right now, is a crisis still a crisis when it's ongoing? I don't know, right? we have a tendency, do we have to say that it's a crisis, right? The perpetual situation of an emergency is not an emergency, right? It's a chronic situation of that is not democratic. What it has shown, what this crisis, this real crisis, the pandemic, which is a real crisis, it came all of a sudden, showed us that things that we treat as crisis, which is something that hurts the rule of law, right, that disrupts the rule of law, something that is anti-democratic, is part of our chronic situation in all of these places around the world, right? So what this new emergency we can say is it makes more visible that other emergencies are not emergencies, right? I mean, you talked about the courts, right? The courts working hand in glove with these non-democratic. So what happens when the law disrupts the rule of law, right? I mean, and that's what happened in the emergency, right? There was a decree, it was all lawfully declared. It wasn't unlawful, it worked with the law. I mean, that's one of the definitions of emergency is when you use the rule of law against the rule of law, right? And I think that what you're saying is that the resilience to crisis is something very dangerous, right? Because if we're resilient, right, if we develop a resilience, that means that we create a discourse, exactly as you say, political apathy, right? Because one of the reasons we like the term emergency is because emergency moves us to action. If an emergency is chronic, we can no longer act against it. An emergency implies action, implies movement. It's the opposite of apathy, right? So what happens when an emergency remains constant? Then we create a sense of apathy, and then we could also have a sense of apathy towards the real emergency, like the pandemic, right? And then we cannot be moved to action because everything has been eroded. The sense of urgency has been eroded, okay? I hope that kind of answers the question, right? But I do think that that one of the things that this emergency has done is it has made very obvious the underlying situation and the lack of democracy and the erosion of democracy around the world, in the US, in Israel, in Brazil, in Belarus, in Russia, all of those, in Poland, right? All of those places, in India, okay, around the world, right? We are seeing how this has sort of brought into relief the problem with the ongoing problem of democracy in these places.
Thank you, ma'am. As I am the moderator, I'm taking a little bit too much of liberty, probably. I don't know. But I have another comment to make before I go to the next question. You have referred to two genres, one being the novel, another being the prison memoir. Now, suddenly I remember that there is flourishing of another sort of literary type, you might say, especially on the emergence of India. I read the novel Great Indian Novel by Shashi Tharoor. It's Shashi Tharoor's Great Indian Novel, and for that matter, Midnight Children, Rushdie. Both these novels, they include specific chapters and sections on emergency, but there the representation is entirely on the mode of a farce. As if a farce is being enacted on the great democracy of India, and the representation of that farce, which is also, of course, very pathetic and tragic for the populace of this country. But this way of looking at the crisis in the mode of a farce, this is something also I found very interesting, especially in case of Shashi Tharoor. He took up the Indian epic of Mahabharata and kind of parallel. Okay, so after we take up the questions, please, if you can add on to this idea of mine.
Can I just respond to that very quickly?
Please, ma'am. Please.
You've just described chapter 4 of my book. Okay, so my book on the emergency is called, it's about emergency genres, and I have a chapter on realism and then a chapter on precisely on Tharoor and Rushdie's representation of the emergency, which is, it's a farce, but it's also an epic, right? So these are two genres that are at work there, is the farce and the epic. And I also have another chapter on allegories, right, where I read Arun Joshi's The River and the City, and oh, now his name escapes me. Malayali writer, Saga of Dharmapuri. His name will come back to me in just a second. Anyway, but what I'm saying is, yes, there are different genres in which they come in. I don't want to go into the whole Tharoor thing, but absolutely, I think that there are different genres, and each genre does something different. There's also a last genre, which is about a spy thriller called The Garland Keepers by Manohar Malgonkar. So what I'm saying is that each genre has a different point of view and has a different thing that they're trying to say about the emergency. But it is significant that both Rushdie and Tharoor go back to rewrite the epics, right, the great Indian epics, especially the Mahabharata, as a farce, right? So, yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Bipin Bihari Goyal. Is it true that emergency is an existential crisis of a state forced upon individuals?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's great, right? I don't, it could be an existential crisis, right? I mean, it could be, I mean, I think it depends in what sense of existential you mean, but I think that it is definitely a crisis of the state forced upon individuals, right? And it is a way for the state to reclaim violence. So, right, I think of it as a thing of violence, right? So it's usually what happens in a state of emergency is the state says the people are violent, there is violence against the state, and therefore the state must retake violence in its own hands and say, violence belongs to me, it can only belong to me, and I will enforce that by violence. But the reason is always violence coming from outside, right? So it's sort of a struggle over who controls violence, but also who controls, right? Who controls the definition of violence, right? What are riots? What is protest, right? Who can protest? When does protest become violence, right? Those are questions, and can violence be used against it? But obviously, what then in this struggle, the people who pay the price are always individuals, and obviously it's differentially, right? People experience emergency differential. If you are poor, if you're lower class, if you're a Dalit, if you're a minority, right? All of these groups of people pay a greater price, right? And so it is individuals, but it is not just any individuals, right? It's individuals differentially who pay the price for this struggle over who controls violence.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Amjad sir has got a question. Sir, so over to you. Amjad sir. Sir,
you're muted.
Amjad sir, your microphone is muted.
Yes, sorry. Okay. Yes, Professor Ishai, I think I'm referring to what Tajuddin said about judiciary now, but you might remember that during the time of Indira's emergency, the judiciary was called the committed judiciary. Similarly, the bureaucracy was also called the committed bureaucracy. And after that, of course, when the 1977 election happened, Indira Gandhi was routed. I remember the Congress party did not get one seat out of 80 in one seat out of 40 in Bihar. You couldn't imagine that Indira Gandhi could be, just disappear from the political scene in 1977. And then every political commentator said that Indian people had great maturity, the common people particularly, they saw through the rhetorics of Indira Gandhi and defeated her. But then again in 1980, the Janata Dal experiment did not succeed. Indira Gandhi came back to power. But now the question is, when we now see the committed judiciary, the committed bureaucracy in 2020, there is an election in 2022, I think, parliamentary election in India. And how do you think? We as if see no hope because of this heady mixture of the nationalist populism of the present government, the majoritarian religious rhetoric, etc. Will the Indian common people be able to see through all these things and pay attention to the economic crisis that is, that has come to India?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. And where I am, I don't know how much you know, right? But here there is the situation in Israel is outrageous in so many ways. There's obviously the occupation of the Palestinian people and the oppression of the Palestinian people. There is a prime minister who has 3 counts of real serious corruption against him. He's not going anywhere. We went to the polls to vote 3 times in the past year. 3 times in the past year.
Yes.
And he was voted again. So obviously we're doing, I don't know, right? I go to protests and I go to demonstrations, and you think, I think it's one of the problems of our time, right? Is this nationalism, is the populist nationalism, right? This fundamentalism, this populist fundamentalist nationalism, where you think, oh, we will expose these truths, and then you say, no, he can be accused of corruption, and we'll go on, right? No one cares. So the very sense of, for us, it would be unthinkable. If someone told me 15 years ago would be a prime minister with 3 counts of serious modes of corruption against him, serious economic situation, growing oppression, all of these things are happening. Would he stay? I would say, no, of course not. The people would vote him out. So we're in a new kind of political situation that we don't know what to do with, right? And what I'm trying to understand is how in this, the logic of emergency has been used against. So we are saying emergency, us, I'm saying the people who are pro-democracy, okay? We're saying emergency, but the more we say emergency, the more it works against us, because the more we say emergency, the more the Sarkar, the government, right? The more the government says, yes, it's an emergency, therefore I must be stronger, right? It's working against us. And that's what I'm trying to do, also show with the Kumar thing, with the borrowed wings, right? How these things can be co-opted. And another thing that I wanted to say is that the committed judiciary, right? Again, the emergency works in different ways for different people. On poor people, on disenfranchised people, on marginalized people of all kinds, it works by force on them. But on the middle class, on the upper middle class, on the judiciary, on journalists, on all those people, it works by co-optation.
Yes.
Come with me, and then with me, you can have access, you can have power, you can have, right? And we see this in emergency. I don't have time to go into it, but one of the really interesting things in my research is the rise of the middle class in India, the English-speaking middle class in India, through the emergency, by co-optation in the emergency. Okay, so the emergency works in different ways on the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the minorities, and on those who are in, who sees this as a way for upward mobility and the rise of the middle class. And I think we need to differentiate between that. Not all citizens of an emergency are equal.
So where is the light at the end of the tunnel?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm old school. I'm like, speak truth to power. I go and I write in the newspapers when I wrote this thing for a newspaper and I compared the situation today to Indira Gandhi. Like I tried to use my research. We teach, it's what we do. We teach, we protest, and maybe something, I don't know, but it's yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I wish I had something smarter to say, but I think we need to keep talking. I think we
Yes.
must not let it be silenced. We must not let ourselves be silenced, and I think that's the most important thing. And these are not good times around the world. No.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. That sense of desperation that you are having, most of us are sharing the similar sort of desperation, and that emergency-like ambience that we do have. It has become a kind of recurrent phenomenon in the Indian politics. Whenever there is election is at the horizon, suddenly we find a kind of crisis or something like this is also accompanying that election. So the strong man is needed, and the rhetoric that is, or the narrative that is propagated by that strong man or strong leader, it is believed. In fact, one of my newspaper articles, I used an expression, willing suspension of disbelief regarding this.
Nice.
That there are many other people who can see through the rhetoric, but somehow, because of that ambience of crisis and a kind of emergency, okay, let us forget for the time being that these are the things that this man has done. Let us put him into power. This is the kind of willing suspension of disbelief that even acts upon the platform of election. People with some rational sense, they can understand, but consciously or unconsciously, they choose to believe, or rather suspend their disbelief. That is how I understood the rise of right-wing politics in India. Okay, ma'am. Now, okay, please.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that that's great. I like that a lot with a suspension of disbelief, and I think that one of the things in this current is that this current emergency fragments us. Right, we're all in our home, in our little Zoom rectangles or Google Meet rectangles, and we're fragmented into little things. And I think that one of the things that we do need to do during this time is insist on resisting that fragmentation, which is why I was so delighted when you asked me to come and speak, because I think it is places like this where we can get together, where we can talk, where we can raise consciousness, where we can compare notes. I think that's crucial. I'm a big believer in conversation, and I'm a big believer in talking. And I think that's what the best thing that we've got to do. And we now have this technology that allows us to talk. I'm painting a pessimistic picture, but I'm not a pessimistic person. And when I'm not pessimistic is because when I'm with my students, I'm not pessimistic. When I'm with you, I'm not pessimistic. When I'm with, it's when we have these conversations, I don't know what the end will look like and how to bring it, but I know it comes from conversation, and I know it comes from talking, and I know it comes from asking questions. So I'm also old school that way. I'm an optimist. I'm not a pessimist, even though it really doesn't look good now.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. The next question is from Shormishta once more. V.S. Naipaul depicts the perpetual darkness, political particularly, while depicting India. Does that indicate a discriminatory and exclusive attitude towards the nation, which is doomed to failure in coping crisis? You might see the question in the chat box.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that goes back to, I said a little bit, like, there's a critique of mystery, of Orient mystery and Nepal and others, right? That their depiction of India is all bad. It's all poverty. You know, people say poverty porn. It's all poverty. It's this romanticization of poverty. India is doomed to always be poor and dirty and authoritative and anti-democratic and so on and so forth. Maybe it's because, you know, going back to my optimism, maybe it's because I don't see neither mystery nor Nepal like that. And again, mystery I know more than Nepal, but I think that, and it maybe comes from being a Victorianist, okay? I think that this realistic, difficult, hunkering down description of the bad, the relentless. I think it comes from a belief in opening our eyes and looking at things directly, not because that the horizon lies, but not because there is no horizon, but in order to get to the horizon, we have to look directly at what is the problem, right? So I think that mystery says, in order to move forward, we have to acknowledge that is in which is right. So mystery is writing this novel in 1995 when the emergency has practically disappeared from it. You know, it's not talked about like it was talked about today. And he says, let's go back there and see what happened. Because if we pretend it didn't happen, if we say, oh, this is an anomaly, this doesn't belong, then we have to take all the parts. So, for me, that's what realism does. It means we need to get bogged into the dirty, nitty-gritty details in order to emerge from them. So, but I understand this criticism, but again, I think it is important. I think there is something also that allows us to see some kind of political horizon. I think it's, yeah. Look, mystery is the only person writing about the emergency in the emergency fiction that I see that writes about Dalits. Now, it's a problematic representation. I'm not saying it isn't, but it's there, right? He addresses these problems. So.
Ma'am, if the moderator allows, I mean, just to add to you, that he also tackles the problems of the minorities, like in the character of Ashraf Chacha.
Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. And again, you know, other Muslim characters in some of the other novels I can think of are elite, you know, middle class, right? They're sort of Delhi. Sagal has a Muslim. But here he's saying, let us look at what it means, not for those who were co-opted in it, but for those who were the objects of it, right? And he also presents a really strong relationship between the Muslim camp, between Ashraf Chacha and Ishwar and Om. It's a very interesting book, I think. And I think in those ways that mystery sort of brings hope in the details, not in some glossy way.
Ma'am, the next question is from Harish Kumar.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to think of human-made environmental problems as a long-term emergency? And does it has silent political significance? Question from Harish Kumar.
Of course it does. And so I don't, you know, I was thinking after I heard the first talk on Friday, I was thinking about it a lot, and I think that for many of us in Israel-Palestine, right, there always is something more urgent than the environment, right? Even with activists. First the occupation, first poverty, first this, first that. The environment, that's rich people, they should take care of it. And on one hand, yes, right? The United States is the greatest polluter, and they should take care of it. But of course, it's all of our problem, right? The fact that they're the greatest polluter doesn't mean that we are not, we're all going to pay this price together, right? I mean, look, the environment is the biggest place where solidarity matters. Again, my old school thing is solidarity, right? That's why I believe in talking. That's why I believe in saying, look, this battle is our battle, and your problem is my problem is your problem. We stand together, right? And the environment is the most important place where that exists today, but it is also the place where we feel most helpless, right? Because it's in such a large scale. But if the COVID-19 has shown us something, it is that the whole world can come and battle something together. So maybe COVID will show us a way, the coronavirus pandemic will show us a way to act together globally against this environment. I mean, it's obviously an emergency, but it's also obviously a long-term emergency, and we need to see what we can do. I don't have answers. Professionally, I don't know much about the environment, but it is another thing I'm very worried about.
Now, one last question is from Tausif Ahmed. He has this question. Emergency has become the new normal, especially in India. Is traditional democracy liable here? Does it need rectification?
Well, I think democracy is viable everywhere. I think it's a necessity. Does it need rectification? Absolutely. It's obviously not working for us. And obviously, in the name of democracy, anti-democratic measures are being carried out. So yes, right? If emergency has become the new normal, something is wrong with our democracies. And if something is wrong with our democracies, we need to understand what it is, right? Again, part of the problem with this populism is a very populist understanding of democracy as the rule of majoritarian rule. That's not democracy. That's not democracy, right? But most people have come to believe that it is democracy. It's part of this populism, this political populism that is going on, right? And it is what allows democratic regimes to behave undemocratically. And what we have to recognize, and again, I think genre is important here. I think we need to see how democracy is talked about, right? What are genres of democracy? And we need to separate this idea of majoritarianism from democracy in India and elsewhere.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. Thank you very much. It was indeed a very illuminating session, very enriching one for that matter. And now I would like to hand over the session to the conveners of the webinar. The 5 sessions are done. We are almost at the end of the webinar. So it's now over to Shormishthadi and Rohan, 2 of our conveners. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ma'am, thank you again as a convener. On behalf of the department, I thank you for being with us, for giving us your very, very precious time. Thank you so much. And with this, I think I will hand over to Rohan to do the rest of it. Rohan, over to Rohan.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. We come to the end of our 3-day-long webinar. At the very outset, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, sir, our Registrar, sir, and all the other officials for allowing us this space and supporting us throughout this webinar. I would like to thank our esteemed speakers, Professor Yishai, Professor Samantok Das, Professor Ferrando, Professor Sumana Roy, and Professor Scott Slovic for being so kind, for agreeing to our proposals at such short notices, and supporting us over here. Thank you for your valuable talks and time. We would like to collaborate with you soon again. I would like to thank my colleagues at the department who had been constantly supporting me. And a very special thanks to Professor Dr. Mohammad Riaz, our colleague from the Journalism and Mass Communication Department, who has been instrumental in this webinar, supporting us throughout with all his technical advices and support. I would like to thank two of my students, Kareem and Zayed, for making such beautiful posters for this webinar and making it a success. And thank you, last but not the least, thanks to all the participants over here, my students over here, my colleagues, other academicians for coming over here, supporting us and being with us for all these 3 days. And your participation, your pertinent questions, your ruminations over this seminar made it all the more a success. Thank you. We'd like to bring such academic endeavors in the future soon. And thank you for being with us. Thank you for all your support. Thank you.